Prior to the Civil War, loading and firing a musket was a very long process and usually took between 35 and 45 seconds. The process usually involved filling part of the barrel with gunpowder, adding a patch, shoving the musket ball down the barrel, and then loading the pan with powder, pulling back the hammer, and firing. During the Civil War, this process was greatly improved with the invention of the percussion cap and then the rifled musket. The rifled musket did take longer to load, but gave you a more accurate rifle once you did load it. The rifled musket had an average effective range of around 200 to 300 yards versus the mere 50 yards of the muskets of the previous age. The most common example of the new rifled muskets was the Springfield rifle, which the Union used during the Civil War. This rifle was created in 1861, and there were eventually more than 700,000 of them produced. This rifle was accurate up to around 300 yards due to the rifling and the mini ball, which it fired, versus the smooth ball and the smooth bore of the previous muskets. The Springfield rifle also had another innovation in addition to the rifling versus the previous muskets. The Springfield rifle used a percussion cap system to ignite the charge instead of a flintlock system. The percussion system used a cap which when hit would ignite the powder inside the rifle, versus the flintlock system which would hit a piece of steel, igniting the powder in the pan, flashing in front of your face before igniting the powder in the barrel. This system was faster and easier to use versus the muskets of the previous age. This system still had one disadvantage though, over the breech loading systems of the newer rifles. This system still required you to load the projectile and charge from the muzzle or end of the barrel. In this system, you would have to take a much longer time to put the projectile into the part of the barrel where it would be fired versus breech loaders where you would place it in the beginning of the barrel and it would be ready to fire. This resulted in a lower volume of fire or rounds per minute than the breech loaders which succeeded it. Another major innovation of this type of rifle was the rifling, thus gives it the name rifle. The rifling would help to stabilize the projectile in flight by spinning it and allowing it to stay truer to its flight path instead of wobbling like the traditional musket balls. This would allow you to increase the range from a mere 50 yards of the early muskets to around 200 to 300 yards. The Sharps carbine is a great example of the next generation of rifles. These rifles would load from the breech rather than the muzzle, so they would be faster and easier to load. This would make it easier for new troops to use and would also increase the volume of fire a veteran troop could put out, thus allowing a smaller force armed with the breech loading rifles to fend off a larger force armed with muzzle loading rifles. This also allowed the rifles to be used from a larger number of positions, such as prone, because in previous ages you would have to either stand up or kneel to load your rifle. Now you could stay prone and load your rifle without exposing yourself. The Sharps carbine used a paper cartridge which still had one fundamental problem. If the cartridge got wet and then the powder would also, it would be unusable because the powder would be wet and wouldn't fire. This is where the advance in the next rifle really came in handy. The Henry rifle was invented in 1860, however never saw widespread use during the Civil War. Instead, it was in the hands of those wealthy soldiers and a select number of cavalry who purchased a rifle on their own. However, this number was limited because the Henry rifle was around $35 or $40 in 1863, or $650 to $750 in today's money. Despite the cost of the new rifle, it did have several advantages over the old ones. This is why many people bought the rifle. They bought it thinking that if they got a superior rifle, they would have a better chance of surviving the war. The main advantages which the Henry had over the other rifles of the time were number 1, its magazine system, and number 2, its cartridges. The magazine system could hold 16 shots, which could be fired in rapid succession, thus allowing the soldier to survive if they were confronted by multiple enemies at one time. The other advantage the Henry had was the cartridges that it used. The cartridges that it used were made out of brass and copper instead of the traditional paper, which allowed the cartridges to contain the primer and the shot all in one, which greatly increased the volume of fire that the soldier could put out.
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it.
Fighting a war is a massive undertaking. Not only must you organize thousands of men, transport them to the position that you want them to be at, and successfully lead them in a fight against your enemy, but you must also keep them from starving to death while they're at it. Take, for example, the Army of the Cumberland, as described by political reporter Robert Bateman. The army was based in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with 36,000 men. In order to feed those men, it would require 108,000 meals per day, an amount that is equivalent to 81 tons of food. Not only this, but an army must be kept supplied with ammunition, clothing, horses, and wagons. Often armies were very far away from the nearest base of supply, requiring long wagon chains and supply lines that would stretch for hundreds of miles. This was a massive tactical barrier during the Civil War, as often the need for supplies limited generals from moving for fear of breaking these supply lines. However, with many recent technological advances that aided in this endeavor, such as trains and steamboats, new tactics were born. Often, armies would travel along train tracks or stick close to rivers in order to better supply themselves. Railways, for the first time, also became major military targets. In the First Battle of Manassas, railroads played a huge role. In the battle, the Union forces under General McClellan were attempting to take control of a Confederate railway hub at the town. Because of intelligence reports that the Union was on its way, the Confederates were able to use the railroad to transport large amounts of men to the town. This is an example of two new tactics that previously had never been used. First, attacking the rail yard as a strategic target, and secondly, the Confederate use of the railway as a means of transporting their army, something that had never before been possible. Railways were also a major target of General Sherman's march to the sea, as he too understood the power of this new form of transportation, and specifically tried to destroy railroads in order to cripple the South's ability to continue fighting. Another example of logistical warfare is General Ulysses S. Grant's attack on the city of Vicksburg. The Union again recognized the power of transportation and was determined to cut off the Mississippi River from use by the Confederacy. Rivers have always been used as a means of transportation, but prior to the invention of the steamboat, the transportation of goods had been somewhat problematic and proceeded much more slowly and in lower quantity, especially upstream. Now it was more important than ever that the Mississippi River must be taken. Again, this is a brand new aspect of warfare. These tactics were extremely prolific throughout the war and deeply affected the way that it and future wars would be fought with respect to infrastructure and logistics. In early 1864, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman was at an impasse. Despite the superiority of his forces, Sherman didn't seem able to defeat the will of the Confederate forces residing in Georgia, which continued to oppose him. His plan to deal with this issue would lead to one of the most notorious campaigns in military history and would cement his image as one of fear and terror in the hearts of the people of the Confederacy. His scorched earth policy would later earn him the name American Father of Total Warfare. In a daring plan, he would split his army into two parts. One would go after Lieutenant General John Bell Hood, and the other would wage a psychological war of destruction against the rebels of Georgia. He cut his supply lines, forcing his men to live off the land, and marched from Atlanta, a city which on his orders was nearly burned to the ground. He ravaged the countryside, taking everything of value. Every home, every barn, and every hut was subject to his men, who pillaged for sustenance and destroyed all that could be beneficial to the South in the war. He even used slaves, which flocked to his approaching army, as valuable resources in gathering information about the land. However, for towns that did in fact surrender to him and stop the fight, he would offer generous terms. Sherman realized that he may not be able to fully defeat the armies of the Confederacy, so instead he attacked the people of the Confederacy and their will to continue the fight. According to John S. Marzalek of the Civil War Trust, an executive editor of the U.S. Grant Memorial Library at Mississippi State University, quote, he sought to utilize destructive war to convince Confederate citizens in their deepest psyche both that they could not win the war and that their government could not protect them from federal forces. He wanted to convey that Southerners controlled their own fate through a duality of approach. As long as they remained in rebellion, they would suffer at his hands. Once they surrender, he would display remarkable largesse. This strategy proved to be highly successful. Many historians agree that it likely led to a quicker end of the war as it damaged the morale of the Southern people, making them feel helpless and scared while at the same time damaging the South's ability to continue fighting. Because of Sherman's success and other similar Union campaigns of destruction during the Civil War, this period marks a profound change in warfare, as the strategy of psychological warfare via an attack on civilians, later known as total war, has been reused over and over again by tacticians, all the way through the World Wars and to the modern wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, where it has been laid out in a doctrine known as shock and awe. This is something that is so incredible about the Civil War, that its advances in technology and of thought could have such major impacts both on how it was fought and how future wars would play out. Despite this all, despite the advances made in weapons and tactics, despite the astronomically high casualty rates of the Civil War, despite the hundreds of thousands of people that died, we must always remember that the Civil War was a deeply personal war. And we can't lose that by getting caught up in weapons and tactics. We must remember all the Americans that fought and died for this country that we love. They are not a number, and we must remember them.